The second most common jig fishing mistake that I see guys make, especially when I'm doing on the water fishing lessons or just fishing with buddies, is that they fish a jig under the wrong conditions. And so what I mean by that is they are fishing a jig when it's either windy or cloudy. And the one exception to this basically is the swim jig. The swim jig is by far the most popular jig on the market, and everyone loves throwing a swim jig. And the reason is it's basically like throwing a spinnerbait. You just cast it and you reel it in and you feel them thump it. And that's, to me, like, swim jig fishing is not really jig fishing. It is, but it's more like a spinnerbait or a crankbait than it is a jig. When I think about jig fishing, I'm thinking about a bait that's on the bottom, getting around in and into cover. That's the key. Getting deep into cover around some sort of gnarly object, whether it's big rocks, big laydowns, stuff like that. And whenever you have those situations, one of the keys is finding that sun. And that's something that you talked about here earlier, Randy, and I'm going to pull up that exact same spot actually that you showed. And if we go through time, you'll see that on certain days back in this creek, you're going to have more sun or less sun. And so let me actually find, this is not the best example. Here we go. So like you have a situation here where you have some shade that's cast off these trees. The shade of the trees is going to, or shade around the cover is going to position those fish tight up against an object. And in general, when I'm throwing a jig, 95% of the time it's on a sunny day around some sort of shade that's cast by a brush pile, a dock, a tree, a log. The shade is super key to jig fishing, and I think that's something that's highly overlooked. Now, can you catch fish on a jig when there's no shade? Yes. But you can also usually catch those fish on other baits, like a moving bait. And when I can get away with throwing a moving bait like a spinner bait or a crankbait, I'm going to do that because you can cover a lot more water, you can make a lot more casts in a day. But when it's sunny and calm and there's a bunch of shade on the water because of the sun, usually the crankbaits and the spinnerbaits don't work that well, and the jig is the better option. Therefore, on those days, I'm going to just lock a jig in my hand. But I think that again, is one of the most common mistakes that anglers make, is they try to fish a jig in really cloudy conditions, maybe even really windy days. Even like on windy days, fish will eat a spinnerbait, a crankbait, stuff like that better. But when it's calm, when it's sunny, and when there's shade around, the jig is the go-to bait. Would you agree with that, Randy?
Yeah, there's no doubt, especially when you're fishing around like isolated targets, laydowns, docks, that type of stuff. Shade is really key. The only time that I found that shade, that you can catch a lot of fish on a dark condition or shady conditions on a jig, is when the water's high. Because one of the best lessons I learned how to flip from the master of flipping, in my opinion, a guy named Terry Thomas here that lives in Southwest Missouri. He's a legend here in the Ozarks. He's probably won as many or more tournaments in Missouri than any angler in the state. And I got a chance for him to teach me how to flip years ago, like 30 plus years ago. And the day that he taught me, we fished a buddy tournament together at Grand Lake. We won the tournament with 28 pounds. We caught like 30 bass that day. Terry caught 29 of them. I caught one of them. We were both flipping a black and blue jig, black and blue pork frog, 30-pound test line into the willow trees. And it was literally a heavy thunderstorm, pouring down rain all day long, flipping willows. The only exception that exists that I have seen is when those fish are committed to a flipping position in flooded cover, you can catch them on shady situations. But other than that, it's just like what you said, Johnny. Isolated cover, wood, laydowns, docks, rocks, whatever like that. Most of the time, shade is going to be key because shade is cover for the fish. It provides an ambush point for them. It makes those bigger fish more aggressive. And you need that aggressiveness when you're fishing a jig, because a jig is not a subtle bait, even a small jig. It's a bait that's designed for bigger fish, aggressive fish, and that shade is key.
For sure. And even J Mav's asking, does the sun play a part when jigging offshore brush piles? Yes. Shade is huge on brush piles. You'll find a lot of times when I'm fishing offshore brush, let me pull up an example here, just from one of these maps. I fish a ton of brush piles. I actually have a really awesome video, Randy, from a couple of days ago. I was throwing the fish mode offshore jig and called a 7, a 6, and a 5, and a 4 on brush piles, all in a jig. And basically, like if we pull up, here's an example of an area that has a bunch of, let me find it, has a bunch of brush piles around it. You can see, if we go back to like this situation, you can see there's some brush here. Let me find a better brush pile. There's a bunch of them on this lake somewhere. Let me find one that's sticking out. Here we go. So here's a brush pile. So this is a brush pile like this. And what you'll find is that whenever you have a sunny day, even when you're fishing offshore in 15, 20 foot of water, the shade is what those bass will use to ambush bait fish that are swimming around in the middle of the lake on those bright sunny days. On a bright sunny day, the shad can see the bass from a long ways away. Same thing with the bluegill or whatever other forage the bass are feeding on. And so on bright, sunny, calm days, the shad can see the bass coming from a long ways away, especially if you have 2 to 3 foot water visibility. However, when you have shade, those bass can hang out in that darker area, and those bait fish can't see the bass as easily. And so it's kind of like when you want to jump out and scare someone, you're not going to stand in the middle of a brightly lit room. Instead, you're going to maybe hide behind like a sofa that's shaded, or with some like a darker area, maybe a dark closet or whatever, to jump out. And so those bass, they're going to, a lot of times around brush piles, relate more to the shade than the actual brush pile itself. And I can actually pull up an example on sonar of this, which I think you guys will find really cool. Just give me half a second to pull this up, where you can actually see this happening. And I see this in brush piles all the time, and I don't think a lot of guys really know this, and not something that gets talked about too much. Let me find this. Here we go. Okay. I'm just going to pull this up over here, guys. Sorry, just taking a second to... I had to pull up all these files I was not expecting to talk about. Okay, here we go. Let me share my screen here. There we go. Okay, so got this this spot here, and it's a brush pile that I graphed, and I caught some fish in offshore, and this right here is the brush pile. And you can see the fish right here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 fish. And if you notice, a lot of these fish are not actually positioned in the brush pile, even though it's a bright, sunny, calm day. Instead, they're off to the side. And this is actually the shaded side. So if you think about it, like the sun is over here, maybe in the top left corner, and that sun is hitting this brush pile, and these fish are sitting in the shade of that brush. They're not in the brush, they're in the shade of that brush. And this is where you find a lot of fish when you scan brush piles with down imaging. They're off to the right or to the left on sunny days. Now when it's cloudy, the shade isn't there, and because there's no shade there, these fish a lot of times won't actually relate to brush at all. They'll just start randomly swimming around chasing bait fish, and that's what I talked about at the beginning of the stream, where you can catch them just randomly swimming out in the middle with a swim bait or something like that. So when you want to fish like offshore brush piles, the sun is super critical to getting those fish to bite. Now, sometimes bass will kind of be resident fish around certain brush piles, regardless of the conditions. But most of the time when I'm dealing with offshore brush piles, the fish are using the shade of the tree, not so much the tree itself, if that makes sense.
Now, one question I've got on that, Johnny, because I think a lot of viewers may wonder this too, because I don't think a lot of people, this is like when you're talking about deep shade and brush, that most people don't equate that to like an approach in bass fishing. Do you think that those fish, when they're on those deeper brush piles, like that 15, 20, 25 foot of water, do you think they'll come a long distance to get that jig, or do you have to get it in the shade like you do on shallow cover?
You have to get it in the shade. And actually what I find is that most of my bites in a jig on offshore brush come before my bait ever makes contact with the brush. So I'll fire that jig out there, and I'll basically position my boat a lot of times so that I am on the sunny side of the brush pile. So the sun is kind of at my back. That's usually a good practice. And sometimes you don't want to do that to an extent because you don't want the shadow of your boat to get cast in the brush pile, so you have to make sure you stay far enough away. There's a whole thing here to kind of pay attention to with boat positioning. I'll make a video about that at some point. But yeah, basically, you want to make sure that the brush pile is that your cast is coming so that when you bring your jig to that brush pile, you're bringing it into the shade first, then into the brush. Because what will happen is that those bass are sitting in the shade waiting for that jig to come to the brush. And if you bring it into the brush first and over the top of it on the sunny side, back down the other side, those bass are going to basically maybe potentially miss your jig because it gets caught up in the limbs and they can't see it as well. And one thing I do find is that if I am fishing on the opposite side of a brush pile and I have to cast on the sunny side first, I hop my jig up really high and I'll pop it off the brush, and they'll bite it after the jig is popped way off the top of the brush and is falling into the shady spot. So most of my jig bites, I would say 70% of them on offshore brush piles become when my jig is not actually in the brush. It's on the outer edges around the shade. So,
That is, I don't think, I mean, I'd be curious to hear some comments from the viewers right now. That is some high level bass fishing information, because as long as I've been fishing, I never considered that. I never considered shade a thing when you're fishing deep brush piles. I mean, that is just, that's amazing to me like that. I've never even considered that. Most of the time when I'm fishing deep brush, I just think if I get it anywhere near that brush pile, I've got a chance to catch a fish. So, yeah, I'd be curious to hear if anyone else has considered that before, because I learned something right there myself on that.
yeah, one thing the reason I kind of came to that conclusion is actually not from brush pile fishing. I've fished brush piles a ton on Lake Dardanelle and all these places that I was showing on the map. So I've fished so many brush piles before. You pick up those things. It's more just through trial and error. But what I kind of learned that from, let me transition over, is when I was fishing boat docks. And if you fish boat docks on like a deep, clear lake, and you've done this, I'm going to go up to like Lake of the Ozarks, for example. You fish Lake of the Ozarks all the time, Randy. I'm sure you've heard this before. But a lot of times what happens is that with these boat docks, the best place to fish on a boat dock a lot of times is not necessarily on the boat dock itself, but a lot of times it's on the shady side of the boat dock. And I catch a lot of my fish on like a dock like this, casting my jig in that shade line, and the shade is what those fish will relate to more than the dock. So like this dock, this side of this dock right here, not going to be as productive usually unless there's a brush pile there than this side of the boat dock where that thicker shade is. And especially if there's like a rock transition or something on the back side of these deep docks, a lot of times the fish aren't even on the dock itself because the dock might be floating and the bank is super steep. So out here it might be 30, 40 feet of water, but those fish are relating to a rock transition on the bank. Maybe it goes from pea gravel to chunk rock, and then they're using the shade of that boat dock in 20 to 30 feet of water, and that's what you're catching them on. The shade of the boat dock plus the rock transition. And I figured that out when I was like 16 years old, and I kind of was like, oh, well, maybe that's something with brush piles too, and that's kind of how I put that all together.
And that's how so much about fishing technique is learned. It's just by the haphazard, random, it's just almost a mistake you make. And getting back to swim jigs a little bit, so the whole technique of swim jigs, that was basically discovered off of a mistake of jig fishing flipping.
Yeah.
Because I can remember before, nobody, 30 years ago, nobody knew what a swim jig is, or nobody understood what a swim jig did. Once in a while, you'd get a bite. If you flipped into a bush or grass bed, you get a bite as you're reeling the jig back in. And most of the time, you dismiss that as just the random haphazard until it actually became a thing, just like what you're talking about with the deep shade.
For sure. And that's the thing with fishing. There's so many factors, and you have to consider that. And like, who asked that? It was Stanky Fishing asked, what do they use the dock for in that case? Just shade? What I find is that if you're fishing a dock that's floating, the only thing that matters is the shade to those fish. They don't actually care about the dock itself. It's all about the shade, unless there's a brush pile around the floating dock. Now, if you have docks that have wooden pillars that go down into the bottom, then they're actually using the pillars themselves as an ambush point. The only exception for that is when you have like a shad spawn going on, or the fish are like suspended up underneath the floats of the boat docks. That happens sometimes. But if the fish are on the bottom, they're not there because of the dock most of the time, especially the deeper floating docks. They're there because of the shade. It's kind of all... there's a lot of nuances to everything in fishing, but hopefully that makes sense.